This video is all about the immigrant life and food culture from 1880 to 1920. And the inspiration for this presentation is a book that I had the opportunity to read called 97 Orchard Street, An Edible History of Immigration. And I've had the opportunity to visit 97 Orchard Street as what is today known as the Tenement Museum. And I'm going to share the stories of a few different immigrant families that live there. And I will come back to that in just a few minutes. But to begin, I attended a seminar in which someone called this presentation, this time period, this concept of food culture, beer, pretzels, and pickles, a story of the Lower East Side. And there's a reason for using these three terms. One of them is that many of these immigrants that came from Europe, they were more conditioned to drinking for lunch and dinner, younger ages and everything than Americans were, partly because of the fact that there wasn't safe drinking water. And that's going to carry over into their experience in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City, as the idea that they're going to drink a lot more beer. And so in many of these tenements at the basements, as well as other areas, they created saloons. And these saloons are where people would come to eat and drink. And of course, they wanted to serve pretzels because pretzels are salty. And when you have salty foods, you need to drink more. And so that would continue to get people to buy the beer, and it would keep the saloons open. And then the pickling. This is an era before the idea of refrigeration and even especially the idea of a freezer. And so if you were fortunate enough to live in one of the tenements that had a fire escape, you could potentially put your meat or whatever out in the cold. But most people couldn't do that because there weren't fire escapes on every single apartment. And so this led to the invention of pickling to allow foods to be able to extend longer in how long they would last and you could eat them. This is a picture of the Lower East Side around the turn of the century. And a few things to note here is just the massive amounts of humanity, how crowded it is. New York City is still a crowded place today. But we see in here immigrants from many different walks of life. We see them out with carts, push carts, and you're going to learn a little bit more about the foods and everything. But immigrant women relied on these push carts to be able to get their fruits and their vegetables and meats and all kinds of different things throughout the day. And so this became a very important center of life for the Lower East Side. Here is an example of a push cart where they're selling something. I'm not sure what they're selling, but these are super important in the culture and this resource for them to get their food. And one important thing to understand about food and why we're even talking about it is when immigrants left their home country, they were leaving a lot behind. And the one thing that helped get them through was their favorite foods, was their traditional foods. Think about if you were to suddenly move to another country where the food and everything was different, and how if you could just have that hamburger or pizza or salad or whatever it is that you really like to eat, that it would make things a lot better for you. So let's talk about 97 Orchard Street. This is today known as the Tenement Museum. And so you have a picture of today that and what it was look like and what it looked like back then. And a little bit of information about it. It was built in 1863 and it survived as a series of tenement apartments until 1935. But around the start of the 20th century, so around 1900, 97 Orchard Street was the most densely populated square block in urban America. So many people lived here. There were about 2,223 people, most of them Russian Jews at that time, packed into roughly 2 acres. So not a lot of land. 111 of them lived in the 20 apartments at 97 Orchard Street, which was the oldest building on the block. Over the course of its existence as tenements from 1863 to 1935, it's estimated that about 7,000 people from over 20 different countries lived here. This is a 5-story tenement, which was built with 22 apartments, so there's 4 on each level, and each apartment is about 325 square feet, consisting of just 3 rooms. Again, it was built during the Civil War, but it's also built before New York had any kind of housing laws, and people mostly really didn't care what the lodging looked like for working class citizens. A series of laws is going to improve it, but not a great deal. I'm going to show you some of that evolution in a second. But I want to talk first about one family that lived there, the Glockners. And so this area was, again, as I previously mentioned, Klein Deutschland, basically. There's a lot of Germans at the time period that these tenement is built. And Mr. Glockner owns 97 Orchard. He chose, however, not to put in pipes at the time. And those who immigrated from cities settled in cities, and those who came from rural areas tried to go inland to create farms. So that's an important fact to know. In the mid 1800s, people still identified by their German states rather than country. So even though we talk about the German experience, honestly, there's different religions, there's different languages, and food traditions are different from German groups to German group. And they created villages like clusters. As Germans from the same area settled together, they create clubs and they would have activities together. They would help those in distress. They would pay for funerals together. And so when Mr. Glockner purchased this, um, actually, what you see here behind their picture is sauerkraut. And I want to mention that is one thing that cuts across the ethnic boundaries and economic divisions and is important to the German culture. Germans were dairymen, grocers, butchers, bakers. Native borns were surprised by German drinking, as I mentioned, all ages, all meals. They savored it. And again, they drank it because the water was so dirty. And it was also a communal activity. Parents would send their kids for growlers, such as saw beer as a family drink. There's a lot of beer gardens that exist at the time. There was a place called Emmerich's Lunchroom, and there are a few other places that all helped transmit German food into the mainstream of America. And so we have a lot of German influence in our foods today. And that's a little bit about the Glockners. This is the inside of 97 Orchard Street. And I wasn't allowed to take pictures there, but I can describe for you that these stairs were narrow that we walked up. It was the same banister that thousands of people had gone up over the course of many years. And what I want you to think about, though, is in 1863, there was no electricity. Electricity is not actually put into this building until the 1920s, and people started living there in 1863. And so imagine coming home after dark and trying to navigate your way up these stairs to your apartment where you could then have a candle lit of some sort. So it was very dark and dreary and very narrow. And on the right hand side, you can see the layout for the apartments. And there are 4 on each level, as I mentioned, and you have a kitchen, a very small bedroom, and a parlor. And you're going to see pictures of recreated versions of many of these different apartments a little bit later in this presentation. And one thing to note is that there were fire escapes only on one side of the building. And so if you were in the side that had the fire escape, you could put some food outside, which would keep it longer in the wintertime. You'd also get a nice breeze if you were if only in the parlor room. So it's the only place where there's windows. And so on very hot, oppressive days in the summertime, that bedroom was really not a good place to hang out because you weren't getting any of the air circulated. Next, these are images that show the courtyard in the back. And an important fact to note is that when this was put into place in 1863, there is no indoor plumbing. And it was not until 1905 that this was done and that it was equipped and tenants could finally have running water in their apartments. And what you see here, 2 things to point out, is down near the bottom, there is a little bucket, a silver bucket, and next to that is the one water spigot for the entire 22 apartments. So prior to the fact that indoor plumbing was installed, imagine that you were a woman that lived on the top floor, the 6th floor. There's 5 floors plus there's a basement. So on the very top floor, and you had to go down and fetch water all day long, whether you wanted it to cook with, to bathe with, to wash clothes with. I mean, you're constantly going up and down those stairs to get the water. So that was one challenge that early immigrants to 97 Orchard Street had. In addition, you'll notice what you see to the left are actually outhouses. There was no indoor plumbing, so therefore there was no bathrooms. And it wasn't until after 1905 that they were able to install one single bathroom into the downstairs area. So all of these people, 22 apartments, initially were using this outside area, whether it was 100 degrees outside or 20 degrees outside. That's where you had to go to the bathroom. So a lot of hardships that we don't necessarily realize that these immigrants had to endure at that point. Eventually, they will add more plumbing, but even as late as 1935, when this building was condemned for living in and needed renovations, and they chose just to close. It wasn't condemned. They chose not to make any further renovations to keep it allowed to be occupied. There were four apartments on each floor that had two communal toilets. So it got better, but it still wasn't one bathroom per household. So let's talk about another immigrant family. And in this case, we're talking about the German Jewish experience in New York City. And German Jews were initially more orthodox, but it was really hard to stay away from forbidden foods. And so they had to deal with things like shellfish and oysters were an important item, as shown in this picture here. But one of the challenges that Jewish immigrants had was the kosher foods and being able to eat what their religion told them that they could eat. In addition, you had typically had found that the Sabbath was on Saturday, and so Jews would not work on Saturdays. But because when they came to America, that Sunday was more that day off, they had to change away from what their religion asked them to do to make it more acceptable. And there were some that just lost a day of work, and others that did migrate and changed. They felt the pressure of economically to work on Saturday instead of Sunday. And the example of Natalie, this is Natalie Gumpertz here in this picture. And she and her husband lived at 97 Orchard Street. And then her husband went to work one day and he never came home. And he abandoned her. The East Side had so many immigrants that they were able to, that had their husbands up and left. And they had a gallery of missing husbands in the photo section of the newspaper at one point. But Natalie would go on. She was surviving. She decided to she picked up working. She did things out of the house. And years later, someone came by and said that they had some money for her. And she just needed to prove, actually, it was the money for her husband. And she had to just go to court and prove that she didn't know where her husband was. She assumed he was dead. And she had other people that testified on her behalf saying that they hadn't seen him in many years. And so she was able to get some money, which allowed her to move out of 97 Orchard Street into a better environment. But many women didn't have this opportunity. And I think that's what I want to mention about the German Jewish experience. And here is a recreated photo of the Gumpert's apartment. And she would work here in the parlor, and you can see it appears that this is one of the ones that has a fire escape. So she would have been on that side of the building and in better condition. This is the largest room in the house, so this is probably where more people spent time. Get a picture here. And here's the little kitchen. Notice no running water. There is a stove, but she would have had to have brought stuff up. The Baldizzi family, these were Sicilian immigrants, Italian immigrants who came to 97 Orchard Street during the Great Depression. So Adolfo Baldizzi, he came to the United States from Sicily in 1923, and his wife, Rosaria, came either 1 or 2 years later, and it's believed she came illegally, that she was undocumented when she came. And this was after the Quota Act, so there would have been starting to track papers and everything at that point. But she had been from a fairly well-to-do family in Italy, and so it was a hardship for her to come to America. Adolfo had been a trained woodworker, and he lost his job due to the Great Depression, and they had to rely on immigrant aid company societies to be able to survive. And this is a picture of their apartment. Because it's after, it's later on, you can see that there is running water here in the sink because this is after 1905. So they do have a different environment than the previous one, but you can kind of see how small the kitchen is and the parlor over there. And just a fun fact is that they do eventually she does go to Canada and re-enters the country legally and becomes an American citizen. And these are a couple of the documents that show her story. A few other families of note from this time period is the Moors. They were Irish immigrants who came as a result of the potato blight, and they I'm not sure what year that they came in specifically. I'll see if I can find it in a second. But the Irish diet had been varied in Ireland until Oliver Cromwell redistributed land, and at that point, it became all about potatoes before the famine. In the decade before, they were eating about 7 pounds of potatoes per day, so lots and lots of potatoes. And a interesting fact about the Irish that people may not realize as far as food, that most Irish did not eat corned beef and cabbage. It was very Americanized, and um, now we obviously a lot of people eat it on St. Patrick's Day, but it's really not a typical Irish food. And we've kind of done that with cultures throughout American history, where we've kind of co-opted something and made it seem like it was from somewhere that it wasn't. But most of the Irish came in unmarried teenagers, unlike other immigrants who came as families. Parents usually were left behind. Women outnumbered men, and women did the domestic work. And yeah, there you go. That's a little bit about the Irish. And then here is a family, their apartment. And the Rogoshevskis were Russian Jews who came to the United States. And again, they came through Ellis Island, and one of the biggest challenges was again the fact that they um, had specific foods that they were not allowed to eat because the religion dictated that. And so in their chapter of the book, I was reading a lot about the push carts and how they were offering the different foods that I showed you at the very beginning of things, and how women would have to visit these push carts multiple times a day to get what they needed for the next meal because they didn't have any place to store. There was no pantry room in here. There was no ice box or whatever, a refrigerator to keep things from spoiling. And so just imagine again, you're this woman again, top floor. Not only do you have to get your water downstairs, but maybe 2 or 3 times a day you have to go out and buy your food. And it's just such a different lifestyle than we're used to at this point. And here are a couple of pictures from the Rogoshevsky. And this one shows you that you have the kitchen and you kind of can see the bedroom a little bit in the back there. But they had so many children. Um, I forget how many children they had. It wasn't a lot, but it was 3 or 4 children that they had to have this little tiny bed here in the kitchen. So that took up space. And here you can see the parents' bedroom. This is the only shot that I believe I have of the bedroom, and it was super small. That you can see barely fits this mattress. And then the other children would sleep out on this little red sofa here in um, the parlor area, and they probably took those chairs and they moved them over, and then they slept sitting up. Is all I can imagine. So just understand the hardships that these immigrants went through when they came to America. And the last thing that I want to share real quick here is when the tenement museum bought this place and they were going in looking to renovate it, they found this in one of the mailboxes, and it's a late book notice from, it looks like 1928 there, that they had found. So this person never returned their overdue book, we are to assume, I imagine, that they borrowed. So just kind of a fun fact. And I just wanted to mention the credits here because the book that I read was called 97 Orchard Street, if you're at all interested in the food culture. And then the Tenement Museum in New York City is a fantastic place to visit. They have a lot of online tours that you can look at right now, and that is food culture. And you can kind of see that the foods would really be important to them, because if you're living in that difficult of a life where you're having to go to the bathroom outside downstairs every single day, you're carrying water from one single spigot, and all the different families are having to get it at the same time, and the fact that you're so cramped into these areas and you don't have creature comforts we think of today, just imagine again how important having creature comfort foods would be. Food is that one thing that when we're stressed out, when we're tired, whatever's going on in our life, we can find comfort in certain foods that we really love. And so that is exactly what immigrants did, just like we do today. Thank you.